The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. I have often had difficulty recording some of the unusual and interesting cases which I have known about during my long and close friendship with Mr. Sherlock Holmes, because he does not want his name to be too well known. This is why, for several years, I have not written the stories of any of Holmes's cases, because I knew he would not like it. So, it was with great surprise that I received a telegram from Holmes last Tuesday saying, "Why not tell them of the Cornish case, the strangest one I have ever solved?" I have no idea what made him remember this case, or why he suddenly wanted me to write it as a story. But I rushed to take out my notes on it before he had a chance to send another telegram, saying he didn't want me to write it. It was the end of the winter of the year 1897 that Holmes seemed to be ill. In March that year, Dr. Moore Agar of Harley Street had said that the famous private agent must forget all his cases and have complete rest if he wanted to get better. The state of his health was not something which Holmes had any interest in, but the doctor made him realize that he really should give himself a little holiday. Thus it was that in the early spring of that year, we went to stay in a cottage near Poldhu Bay in Cornwall. Our cottage was on the top of a hill, and from it we could see the sea. It was a very wild and windy place, and so it was not very welcoming. There were few trees there because of the wind, and it was also a place where you could walk for a long time without seeing anyone, though there were a few villages around. Holmes was happy because he could go for long walks, and he also had time to read and study the history of the area. We had a very peaceful time there, until one day we heard of a very strange happening. I have said that there were some villages around. The nearest of these was Tredannick Wallace, where the cottages of a couple of hundred people were grouped round a very old church. The vicar of the church, Mr. Roundhay, was also interested in the history of the area, and so Holmes had met him. He was a middle-aged man, a little bit fat, but very kind, and he knew a lot about the local history. We had had tea with the vicar at his house, and had met a Mr. Mortimer Tregennis, who also lived in the house. The vicar, being unmarried, was pleased to have someone else in the house. However, he and his lodger were very different people. Mr. Tregennis was a thin, dark man, who was very quiet and sad-faced. These were the two men who suddenly came into our little sitting room on Tuesday, March the 16th, shortly after we had finished our breakfast and were smoking our pipes before going on our daily walk. "Mr. Holmes," said the vicar in a worried voice, "the strangest and most unbelievable thing has happened during the night. We are so pleased that, by chance, you are here at this time, for you are the man we need most out of all the men in England." I looked at the vicar with very unfriendly eyes, because I didn't want anything to change Holmes's peaceful holiday. But Holmes took his pipe from his mouth and sat up in his chair, looking very interested. He told our visitors to sit down, probably because both men were shaking.
"Shall I speak or you?"
Mr. Tregennis asked the vicar.
"Perhaps I should say a few words first," said the vicar, "and then Mr. Holmes can decide whether we should go straight to the place of this strange case, or whether we should listen to more of the facts from you, Mr. Tregennis. I will explain that our friend here spent last evening with his two brothers, Owen and George, and his sister Brenda, at their house called Tredennick-Wartha. He left them shortly after 10 o'clock, playing card games round the dining-room table, and seeming to be very happy and healthy. This morning, because he likes getting up early, he went for a walk towards their house before breakfast. Suddenly, he saw Dr. Richards rushing towards the house. Dr. Richards explained that he had been asked to go to the house as quickly as possible. So Mr. Mortimer Tregennis decided to go with the doctor. When they arrived at Tredennick-Wartha, they saw a very strange sight. His two brothers and sister were seated round the table, just as he had left them, the cards still on the table. His sister lay back in her chair, dead, while the two brothers sat on each side of her, laughing, shouting, and singing as if they were completely mad. All three of them looked as if they had had a terrible shock. There was no sign of anyone else in the house, except Mrs. Porter, the old cook and maid, who said that she had slept very peacefully and had not heard anything strange in the night. Nothing had been taken or moved, so it was impossible to guess what had frightened a woman to death and made two strong men go mad. If you can help us find out what happened, we will be very grateful to you."
I had hoped that in some way I could make my friend forget about all this and continue his holiday. But one look at his face made me realize he would not rest now until the matter was solved. He sat for some time quietly thinking about what we'd heard. "I will try to solve this matter," he said at last. "From what you have told me, I can say that it does sound a very, very strange case. Have you been to Tredennick-Wartha yourself, Mr. Roundhay?"
"No, Mr. Holmes. Mr. Tregennis came back to our house and told me what had happened. So I at once hurried over with him to talk to you."
"How far is it to the house where this all happened?"
"It is about a mile."
"Then we shall walk there together. But before we go, I must ask you a few questions, Mr. Tregennis."